The Sattler Files.
Welcome back to the Sattler Files. And, well, what's happening in business? What is happening in business? Everyone is going, woe is me, the world is coming to an end, and there is just stress and trouble and poor outlooks pretty much everywhere the eye can see right at the moment. Jamie Holroyd from Stratosfear doesn't necessarily agree with all of that, but he is certainly accessible to an awful lot of information because he's speaking to a lot of businesses, and in fact has just done a presentation on the state of the nation almost in terms of where the economy is, where it's been, where it's going in his opinion. Jamie, is it that bad?
G'day, Tom. How are you? Well, I always tell people, I preface people who haven't met me before, that I'm an optimist by nature and a pessimist by training. And I think I was doing more training than, my personality this morning. So, yeah, look, it's pretty tough. And one of the things that's interesting, particularly for myself, is I've always spent time talking to business owners, right? So a lot of the economic data that comes out, it has it's lag indicators. So it's the last quarter's results, the last half's results. If you talk to business owners on the ground, you actually get a sense of what's going on a lot sooner. Now, Tom, I always say this, we've got to calibrate what we think and feel in WA compared to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. But certainly in WA, it feels like the economy slammed on the brakes fairly hard, right? Now, that intuitively feels correct because if you went back 4 or 5 years ago, there was about $150 billion of resource and infrastructure projects either committed, underway or planned.
Yep.
Right now, in the last couple of years, the major ones of those being the Gorgon Gas Project,
Yep.
The Roy Hill iron ore mine, and also the Wheatstone Project. All of those are nearly finished. So you've got this massive amount, billions of dollars of expenditure, which has basically gone to zero, right? And that's why it feels all of a sudden like the economy's kind of slammed the brakes on. So the people I've been speaking to recently have all been saying the same thing. It's as tough as it's been in a long, long time, as tough or tougher than the 91 recession. So now saying that, this is a mood that's really only taken hold in the last couple of weeks, couple of months. So, look, I always tend to be fairly optimistic about things. It's never as bad as people think. And, even if it is bad, well, what are you going to do about it? You've got to reinvent your business model and continue to be relevant. So.
Do you think, like with that story about tougher since 91 with the recession, do you think there's an element of that back in the good old days sort of thing where we don't really, you remember some of the stuff and some of the bits and pieces stick in your mind, but it's hard to believe when you look around how many people live in great big houses and driving Audis and all that sort of stuff that's going on. Okay, everyone's had to tighten their belt and that sort of thing, but to say it's as bad as the 91 recession is a big call.
Look, I think it's a huge call, right? And so part of what we'll be doing over the next couple of weeks is talking to as many business owners as we can, and both locally and interstate, to try and get a more accurate picture of what's going on. But if you think about it, Tom, that in the recession, it was driven by interest rates, which really put the brakes on the economy in a big way. And part of that was a response to the 87 stock market crash, and government's trying to stimulate the economy, then overcooking it, and then you got one foot on the accelerator, one foot on the brake, and it all ended in a bit of a mess, and all ended fairly dramatically. But if you think about it, if you've got billions of dollars of expenditure, and maybe I'm a mining services company and I've been doing lots of work and it goes to zero, and the order book was last year 100 million, this year it's 20, it probably does feel like a 21 recession,
True.
And it's a scary time for businesses, and it actually creates a fair bit of stress. So, but like all of these things, when you talk about post-traumatic stress, right? So one of the other things is post-traumatic growth, right? And so once you put something under strain and you work out what the weaknesses are, what actually comes out the other end. And I think one of the greatest challenges that we see for business owners is knowledge is not necessarily understanding, right? So we had a client a few years ago who went off and bought a separate business, and we said, listen, it'll be a distraction, it'll take your time, these are all the issues that are going to come up. You're going to be learning on the way. I know you think you can do it well, et cetera, et cetera. So the person went off, bought this other business. Now, 5 years later, says, well, I told you so, right? We're in that I told you so moment. And the really interesting thing was when we asked them about it, they said, look, I probably wasn't going to listen to anyone at that point, right?
Well, that's half the problem, isn't it?
So, you have that knowledge, but you maybe don't have an appreciation for what that knowledge means in terms of the intensity of what's going to be required, your ability to do other things. And this is one of the great challenges. So for any business, you'd say, we're going to have times where it's going to get tough. So when it gets tough, what are we going to do? Do we have a plan in the bottom drawer that we can pull out and dust off and everybody's relatively comfortable about what we're going to do? Or do you run around and panic?
Yeah.
So the people who always seem calm under pressure, they've thought through the scenarios, they've had some sort of scenario planning session, and they're reasonably certain what they're going to do when events transpire. So.
You mentioned interest rates, and of course they've been again on the table recently, another 0.25% drop and all the rest of it. One of the comments I noticed in the presentation, your business presentation, was the fact that does half a point really make that big a difference in terms of stimulation to the market, and is there too much reliance on the Reserve Bank changing interest rates to drive the market up or down? It's an interesting point. I mean, is it more relevant now than it was, say, 20 years ago, or not?
I think some of these minor changes, when you're already at record lows, I would almost say it makes no difference. In fact, it actually has the opposite effect that people say, geez, it must be bad if it's gone to record lows, so it must be worse than we think. If you're cutting interest rates to stimulate the economy, you're actually inducing the opposite effect where you're making people more nervous, and business activity is heavily related to business confidence.
Well, there's an equation at the moment, isn't there? And there seems to be maybe a larger disparity in the market than I can ever recall between business confidence and consumer confidence. And interest rates dropping 0.25 point is not the sort of thing in this current business climate that's all of a sudden going to inspire a businessman to go out and to use the Q&A example the other night, a $6,000 toaster. It's not going to stimulate them to do that if the market is not there. And whereas, and equally, if housing prices are not moving dramatically, which they don't appear to be either up or down, but they're certainly not going up dramatically, again, that sort of interest rate rise is not all of a sudden going to drive another 100,000 people to go out and buy a house.
Yeah, I think everyone's looking for direction, and if you throw into the mix the political uncertainty, we have a very long election campaign. So I just caught up with Howard in the coffee room there, and he said, "Well, geez, an 8-week campaign's not going to help." He's absolutely right. The longer it goes, the more it's going to stagnate. If people ask me, do you have certainty about what the outcome's going to be? I would expect that the Turnbull government probably be returned, and I base that on the fact that people who know more about this than I, that you might lose a few seats, but the seats that matter, apparently they will hold on to those. As to what the new makeup of the Senate's going to look like, we're not really sure. That's
the real question mark, isn't it? Because this thing, I saw an interview on 7:30 last night saying that the Labor Party and the Greens will not, under any circumstance, be teaming up. Now,
until they need to.
That's how I read the argument, that we have no agreement in place, is what they were saying.
Now, Tom, you really imagine this scenario: the Labor Party and the Greens says, "No, we're not going to team up," and the Liberals form government, right? There's no way that's going to happen. So.
No, exactly. And so it was. Bowen really did sort of put it. He was very firm about it, but he was also very careful about it. That they have no agreement in place, which is probably true. Hard to believe, but it might be true from a politician. But exactly that. If push comes to shove and it's the difference between governing and not governing, they'll have an agreement in place.
Yeah, of course they will.
So the Liberals, if they actually slide further from where they are now, which is that seems to be the common expectation, that therefore sets up a scenario for an even more dysfunctional parliament than we already have. And that's what brought about a double dissolution in the first place.
Yeah, look, I think if you go back, and Tom, about 18 months ago, I was at the Turnaround Management Association conference in Sydney, and Malcolm Turnbull was one of the guest speakers, and he was incredible, right? He was, and it was my first opportunity to meet him in a fairly intimate setting, and the persona that everybody tells you about, that he's incredibly intelligent and incredibly articulate, I immediately felt that and saw that. And I think you and I even talked last week that I think both of us, without sort of discussing it, kind of had the impression, well, we're waiting for almost a bag of tricks to come out of the budget that we'd be quite inspired by, which didn't transpire. Then we say, well, we've got 2 months of electioneering. Are we going to see it then, right? And I think both of you and I at the moment looking at each other go, are we going to see it at all, right?
I'm exactly that point. I have to say, I thought there was some really succinct comments about Turnbull on the weekend. The article's about him that he's used his ability and talent and skills to actually get the job, but he has no idea what he's going to do to keep it.
Well, look, I think what happens is, and I used this example this morning at the presentation that we did, but there's, and I stand to be corrected, and I believe the number's 7, but it might be 8. There's only 7 or 8 people that have ever won government from opposition, right? So it's a very small number, right? And I was incredibly stunned by that, how small that was. Now, if you think about people like, we take what we consider to be the most successful prime ministers of the last 30, 40 years would be Bob Hawke and John Howard, right? So they've come to office from opposition with a significant power base, because if I'm a backbencher and our best chance of winning the election is to back these guys. Without them, our chances are reduced. So therefore, if they tell us what we're going to do, we're probably going to do it. Now, if I am a backbencher and I think, oh, geez, would we be better with Malcolm Turnbull or Tony Abbott? Are we better with Julia Gillard or Kevin Rudd? Then suddenly the leader loses all authority. Yeah. And what you start doing is you start picking off the sort of factions within your own party, saying, well, we won't have this and we won't have that. And I think this is exactly what's happened to Malcolm Turnbull. He's ruled so many things out that he doesn't have a lot of options left. Now, my alternate view of history is that if Tony Abbott had been more successful in getting the first budget through, spending his political capital, which he clearly intended to do, making the tough calls and getting the budget repair job well and truly underway, we probably would be sitting here now talking about a broadening of the GST base as a second term agenda. Now, the political theory goes that to do big reform from opposition is too hard. You actually need to be in government now. So that would set up the platform perfectly if Tony Abbott was still there. Now, here's my concern, Tom, is we talk about business confidence, and we can go on and talk about all the inefficiencies of the current tax system, etc. But if Malcolm Turnbull goes to election now and doesn't promise it or doesn't set it as a sort of mandated platform, then it's not going to happen in the next term.
Correct.
Now, provided that he wins a third term, which you'd have to suggest possibly the Labor Party might win the next election.
Yep.
Now, they might be in, it's very unlikely that most governments are only one-term governments. Can happen.
Yep.
But suddenly you're starting to look at saying, well, you know what, our reform agenda that we started in the 70s, which got delayed in the 80s and got implemented a little bit in the 90s and it's kind of half finished, might be pushed out 20 years.
Yeah. It's frightening, isn't it?
A little bit. And we had the question today where someone stood up and asked me and said, why isn't there a greater push to broaden the base of the GST? And my answer was, well, I don't know, right? I don't think it's that hard. I think if it's argued well that the public would understand. I don't see the public marching in the street to get rid of the existing component of the GST.
Well, it's interesting. You go back to the disquiet and the highlight of the article on Q&A on Monday night about the guy that talked about the tax break.
Yeah.
Now, he sort of got slam dunked. They tried to slam dunk him about the fact that, well, so what? You don't pay much tax anyway. Yeah. And he's gone, well, actually I do. Every time I go to the supermarket, every time I put petrol in my car, every time I buy something, I pay tax.
Yeah, and so does everyone else, right? That's the way it should work.
Yeah. And so the argument about the moving at the tax break became really redundant. I mean, he absolutely torched those guys over the argument that almost he wasn't relevant. He wasn't important. And he's quite right that the changing of the formula could have a huge impact on a huge number of people, and then they can make purchasing decisions based on that, whereas you can't if it's a tax regime in a traditional sense, an income tax sense. So I think the GST modification comparatively is a really easy sell.
Yeah.
Because we all know we're in trouble. We all know that we need to generate revenue to be able to spend it. It's a no-brainer. And yet they're tinkering around the edges and talking about, well, tax cuts for business is going to do all this stuff. And you go, and do what? If business, most of them are going to take the tax cut and run because they're going to get them back to square one anyway. It's not going to actually put them in a position where they're going to go, I'm going to employ an extra 20 people because of the tax cut.
I think the challenge with the tax cut, particularly for small business, and I mentioned this last week, they hate differential taxes. So at least the government has a long-term plan to realign it. So it means we're going to have some distortions over the next umpteen years until that happens. But look, small business is doing it tough. Small business is the largest employer sector in the Australian economy. And the government's trying to do something to assist. Now, the challenge with small business is when I pay myself a dividend that it gets taxed at the company level and then it comes out to me at the personal level and I pay the top-up tax. So unless I'm leaving all that equity in the business, the tax doesn't make much difference at all. So,
correct.
Yeah. Now, for larger business and building the balance sheet and, having some internal funding, it certainly will help. And I think it's a step in the right direction. But the truth is, if you increasingly want to keep loading up the people who pay the most tax with more tax, suddenly they will lose the incentive to continue to do things. So because the return's just not there. And what we're seeing at the moment is businesses are telling us they're working a hell of a lot harder to try and generate the same return. And you've got business owners who run large businesses who, for the immediate future, will probably earn significantly less than they would if they worked for an equivalent role inside a company as an employee. So, and I think that's of concern.
The whole that's a really interesting argument about the political will. I mean, I think that's actually, if anything does bring Turnbull unstuck in this election, is that he's shown that he hasn't got the political will to make the hard decisions. That's how it appears at this stage, is that, he rode in 7 or 8 months ago as the knight on the white horse sort of thing, going to save the world from the evil Tony Abbott, and he hasn't. He hasn't done anything. He hasn't said anything of significance that makes anyone believe that he's the great saviour that he was made out to be. And so consequently, all of a sudden, Bill Shorten, who was, as good and dead and buried as a potential Prime Minister, is actually in with half a shot because of the fact he's saying, well, actually, we can fix it if we do this. His arguments may be flawed. He may be flawed, and many people think so. But Turnbull seems to have really shot himself in the foot by not being the bold Malcolm Turnbull that he appeared to be when he wasn't the Prime Minister.
Well, look, Tom, this is what's always easy, right? So the challenger always has an advantage because they're not accountable for anything, right? You can do and say anything and you would think it's all going to be easy. But look, the reality is, whether it's been Rudd or Gillard or Abbott or Turnbull, that fundamentally it hadn't changed the universe, right? You still got the same issues to deal with. You still got the same challenges of getting your backbench and your majority of parliamentarians to support you. You still got the same people in the community who start to arc up about things. Now, what you find is, from a political point of view, that the opponents of Tony Abbott were all back Malcolm Turnbull, right? So he sounds nice and warm fuzzies, and as soon as he becomes Prime Minister, they will turn their focus to him, right? Yeah. And so suddenly he doesn't have the same gloss that he had before. Yeah. Now, why is this important? Because if I'm a business owner and I want confidence to do things, I need to have certainty before I go and spend a couple of $1 million and take a risk and employ people. So
there seems to be, and it seems to be the political thing, but also, I suppose, even from a business owner's point of view, there's not much ability to have vision about what's going on because there's so much, there's almost an opinion that this is how it is, this is your lot, this is how it's going to be for a while, suck it up, princess. That's a pretty tough one to take, and it's not very inspiring, I have to say.
Look, I think what happens is that often the people in charge of the strategy, so they come up with a strategy and they lose focus as it's being executed. And I had this sort of vision, Tom, as I was driving here, thinking it's like being on a plane and the pilot starts, serving the meals, right? Like, man, what are you doing, right? Get back and fly the plane, right? Yeah. And people get distracted. And I saw this, beautiful footage the other day, and it was the debate between before the presidential election between George Bush and Al Gore. And Al Gore was sort of in a debate. They sort of said to him, well, why should you be president? And he was sort of, chanting this mantra about how, basically he was going to Americanise the world and have people have our values. And it was interesting because now with the benefit of, history, George Bush goes, we're not going to do that. He goes, we're not going to go around and tell people how to do things. And, if we were ever going to use our military might, we'd make sure that we had really clear objective and a really clear exit strategy and all the things, if you fast forward, just go, that's exactly what you should do. Like exactly. And somehow along the way, it got lost.
Yeah.
And this is what happens in business. We start with an objective. we go down a certain road and the mechanics and machinations of execution means we often lose sight of what the objective is. And it's a bit like we said last week about the one-day cricket example. In one-day cricket, you all focus on every ball and the run rate ratio for every single delivery. Right now, in terms of execution, that's what you need to do. And I think where politicians have really gone wrong in the last couple of years is, I think, if you think back, 20, 30 years ago, and again, this is my impression, and maybe as I'm older and more experienced, your perception of reality changes, but my perception always is that the government seemed to be focused on policy and execution, and when we get a chance, we'll give the opposition a whack, right?
Yeah.
Now it's primarily focused on the opposition. That seems to be how everything is directed, and it's almost like we'll look at policy when we get a chance.
Yeah, because there's certainly a shortage of policy being put in the marketplace by both parties at this point in time.
Well, look, I sit here and say, we've got an election in Australia and one in the US. Is there anything that I'm inspired by or excited by? And it's marginal. So.
In terms of someone operating a business, I mean, we're sitting here pontificating about, political process and what one party might do over the other one, that sort of thing. But in practical terms, you're running a business, you're doing it tough at the moment. What do you do?
Look, I think one of the challenges is there's a lot of organisational stress that's built up. So we've got some clients doing very well. We've got some clients doing it tough, and we sort of had a team meeting this morning, went through what are the common characteristics. Well, the common characteristic is everyone's doing it tough. It's a lot of work. Yep. Everyone's putting in a lot of effort. The challenge is always around execution. So even if we know what to do, how do we know how to execute? And that's often our role. So we might help our clients refine the strategy, but we're also helping them with the execution, because often they don't have the time and space to be able to execute. Now, there's normally two barriers to execution. One is you don't have the skills, or two, you don't have the resources.
That's so to focus on that, to take that to expand on that in terms of the sort of resources and the skills. First of all, I suppose identifying that you haven't got the skills or resources is the first point, isn't it?
Yeah, and that sometimes, it sounds perfectly obvious, Tom, as you and I sit here and talk about it, but often it's not that apparent. So.
No, when you're that close to it, sometimes you feel like you're drowning and, what do I do? What do I do?
Well, and this is a great example. So what happens is business owners tend to beat themselves up, right? They say, well, I'm just not working as well as I thought. And we use it, referring back to the political example, but Kevin Rudd's probably a great example where, you kind of had all the sizzle, but the sausage didn't match the sizzle. And you say, well, hang on, you maybe had a strategy, but you just couldn't execute it.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe you didn't have the skills or resources or experience to execute what you were going to say. So my colleague, Dr. Paul Anderson always talks about the normal problems that you should expect. So what are the normal problems in a business? And you are going to have a period of downturn. How are you going to manage when revenue drops? What's going to be? Are we going to cut costs? Are we going to invest in business development resources? What's our capital base? How long can we go for during a downturn, and have all those strategies lined up as we talked about before. But the other thing we're seeing, Tom, in big business is, as it gets tougher and, roles are rationalised, you start to unleash a whole bunch of unintended consequences. So as people become desperate to hold on to their seats, right, you end up with this zero-sum game where you unleash bad behaviour, where you and I are competing for the one seat. So suddenly it's in my interest not to help you, not to assist you, and that can really embed a really toxic culture. So there's been a sort of avalanche of, toxic employees that people have been dealing with. So.
We spoke a few weeks ago about mergers. Is this likely to facilitate a lot more merger discussions where one company, is a bit vulnerable at this point in time, but it's still generating a bit of cash, so therefore the cash flow becomes crucial, makes common sense if they can get those efficiencies and scale to actually merge with another party?
Well, this is part of what we talk about, kicking the can down the road, right? So in the middle of the GFC, economists talk about creative destruction, right? So the economy needs to almost attack itself and reinvigorate itself. So what happens is if I'm a business owner and I'm in the survival of the fittest, I'm the weakest, right? So my business collapses, my employees are freed off to go and pursue other activities. My resources become available to my competitors who typically buy them maybe at a discounted margin, and then it all goes away and becomes more efficient again, and the economy takes off. Now, during the GFC, when you stimulate things or, prop up businesses, that process doesn't happen. And I kind of equate it to, it's a bit like your favourite football team. You're watching them, they're doing okay, and they kick lots of points, right? That's another point. And you think, geez, if they kick goals, they'll be miles in front. Now, what happens is, kicking a point is like having a low productivity asset that's just not producing, right? Yeah. And you just can't go on forever. And eventually, like most teams kick a lot of points, you end up losing the game. So.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a valid point. To contact you and have a discussion, because I'm sure there's lots of people that want to have a discussion about where they're at if things are tough. What's the best way?
People can contact me on my number 0422 907 902, or they can contact me via the Stratosfear webpage. So
Stratosfear is spelt with an F-E-A-R on the end, not the stuff up in the sky.
No, that's right. No need to fear if you've got Stratosfear. So.
Exactly right. Jamie Holroyd, always good.
No, thanks, Tom. My pleasure.
And so you can contact Jamie Holroyd at stratosfear.com.au, and we'll be back with more very shortly on the Sattler Files.
This is the Sattler Files.
That's great, mate. Well done.